morning. My name is Emily Ender, and I will be your host on this week's episode of How in the World Did We Get Here? Today, we have a brilliant physicist joining us from the UK, here to tell us all about the experiment that took the world by storm, the gold foil experiment. Please tell us your name and give us a rundown on what this experiment is all about.
Thank you for having me, Miss Ender. My name is Ernest Marsden. I am a British physicist from the UK, and between the years of 1908 and 1912, we conducted this experiment where we launched an alpha particle from a radioactive device, and the alpha particle was positively charged. So we shot it at this piece of gold foil that was surrounded so that we could tell where the particles were landing after it passed through the piece of gold foil. So once it passed through, these deflected particles would go in all different directions. And later we would come in and we would figure out the direction in which they went and the amount in which they went in. So some went straight through, some took a very sharp curve in each direction, some even came back towards the particle emission.
Okay, so launching these alpha particles through the foil and seeing where they scattered, what exactly were you trying to do? What was your goal here and your sense of accomplishment in conducting this experiment?
Yeah, so essentially the purpose of this experiment was to try to get a more accurate model of what the atom actually looked like. Previously, before we began this experiment, the model that we had was called the plum pudding model, and essentially it was described exactly how it sounds. It was pudding, and that was the substance of the atom, and within it were the electrons as if they were plums placed within the pudding, and so it was one uniform structure. Well, we really wanted to launch these alpha particles and figure out where they were going so that we could have a more accurate description of what it actually looked like. Could we determine that yes, the plum pudding model was the best model, or was there something even better?
Okay, so in trying to figure out exactly what that model looked like and either confirming this plum pudding model or changing the way we looked at the atom, where did you conduct this experiment?
Yes, absolutely. So we conducted this experiment at the University of Manchester in the UK, which is where I'm from. So it was really exciting and fun to be able to take part in the university that I was at and in the country that I was and be able to work on some groundbreaking things.
So I know you mentioned previously that this experiment was conducted between the years of 1908 and 1912. So what exactly was going on around you in the world as you were at the University of Manchester shooting alpha particles? What all was happening outside?
Yes, so there were quite a few things that were going around in the world around the time that we were conducting this experiment. So towards the beginning in 1908, there were a lot of tension-filled events that happened. There was the annexation of Bosnia, and this was from Austria-Hungary, and this really caused a lot of problems within the world, and it kind of set the stage for World War I to begin. So that was very tragic as far as world history. But one other thing that happened around that time was in the technological world, Henry Ford developed the Model T. So we began to get this new idea of travel and of exploration of world. Obviously this happened over in America where I currently wasn't, but it still took the world by storm that we were changing this idea of human movement. So that was towards the beginning of when we began this experiment, but towards the end, over 1912, about 4 years later, we had a wonderful geographer, Alfred Wegener, who challenged the idea of continental drift. So he challenged what we now know as the world being made up of tectonic plates. So that was really that first idea about do we really know how the surface of our Earth is made up? But along with the surface of the Earth, as we were exploring it and as we were taking some voyages, we unfortunately had the tragic event of the Titanic sinking, where over 1,500 people lost their lives after the Titanic hit an iceberg very shortly on its voyage.
Wow. So a lot of tragic events were taking place as you were conducting this, but also a few things were happening in geography and in the technological world. So getting back to the experiment, who all did you work for or work with when you were doing this experiment?
Oh, two of the wonderful physicists that I got to work with during this experiment were Hans Geiger, and he is a German physicist, and I worked very closely with Hans throughout this entire experience, through those 4 years, and our professor, Ernest Rutherford. So Professor Rutherford really liked Hans Geiger and some of the ideas he had presented previously, so he brought him on to work on this project. And Professor Rutherford, it was his whole idea. He was the mastermind behind this experiment and the setup and the theory that what does the atom actually look like? So it was wonderful to be able to work with them and call them colleagues as we worked on this.
Okay, so working with Professor Rutherford and working with your colleague Hans, what was your role in this experiment exactly? What were you required to do or asked to do by your professor and your colleague as you were working on this?
So during the conduction of the experiment, I was working on my undergrad. So I didn't have a very large role in the experiment, but it was very vital. So every time we launched a particle through this gold foil, I would go in and I would count all of the particles and where they landed so that we could compile all of this data and we could take it back and figure out this direction and this numerical value of where these particles were going, and then be able to construct a physical idea based on the data that we were given. So essentially what I did was compile all of this data for the two brilliant physicists that analyzed it.
So after you counted all of these particles and figured out where exactly they went, what impact did the result of your experiment have on the physics community or science community, even mathematics community?
At the end of our experiment, what we found, the results that we had, was that the atom did not look like the plum pudding model that I mentioned earlier. So the model is a very positively dense center, which is what we now know as the protons. So it was positively charged and it was very dense in the center. However, the rest of it was surrounded by this cloud of empty space with electrons in it. So based on the plum pudding model, yes, the electrons were kind of scattered. However, the positive charge did not surround those electrons. The electrons were floating around this positive center where the protons are.
Finally, Mr. Marsden, I have one more question for you. What is the hope for the future with not only the experiment, but the results of your experiment?
So our hope for this project and the future of what we have found is that the world of physics and chemistry can use this little piece of information and build on it forever and ever, because science is such an evolving foundation that we have, and it's never going to be completely figured out. So our hope for the future of this experiment is that we will continue to grow and we will continue to learn, and we will be able to discover things that just a few years ago we believed to be impossible.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Marsden. I really want to thank you for giving us this opportunity to hear about your experiment and learn about the wonderful things and the impact that you and your colleagues had on the physics community. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Ender, and we will see you here next week on a new episode of How in the World Did We Get Here? Thank you.